Everyone needs some time alone, and voluntary solitude can sometimes be calming and restorative. But being alone by choice is very different from having isolation imposed on you. When a person is suddenly cut off from normal social contact and meaningful activities, the consequences can become surprisingly broad. People respond differently, and the timeline varies from person to person, but the longer severe isolation continues, the more difficult its effects can become. If someone is confined to a limited environment for days, weeks, months, or even years, without meaningful interaction or productive activities, both the mind and body can begin to change. So, what exactly happens, and why does prolonged isolation have such a powerful effect? In the beginning, the body may react as though it is facing a threat. Stress hormones can rise, and if the situation continues, that temporary response may develop into ongoing stress. Human beings depend heavily on communication, relationships, and purposeful activities to maintain emotional balance. One reason may be something psychologists describe as social reality testing. Other people give us opportunities to compare our thoughts, interpretations, and reactions with an outside perspective. Without that feedback, it can become harder to determine whether our assumptions and perceptions are reasonable. As isolation continues, a person's thoughts can become increasingly repetitive. Emotions may become harder to regulate, and the ability to maintain a stable sense of self can weaken. For some people, prolonged isolation can contribute to serious psychological problems, including depression, anxiety, obsessive thinking, and disturbances in perception. The brain itself may also respond to prolonged stress. Areas involved in emotion, fear, and stress regulation can become increasingly reactive, leaving a person more sensitive to perceived threats. At the same time, prolonged stress may interfere with the functions of the prefrontal cortex, an area heavily involved in planning, attention, decision making, and self-control. When these systems become disrupted, clear reasoning can become more difficult while emotional reactions may become stronger. The longer this pattern continues, the harder it may become to break out of it. A person can become increasingly vulnerable to anxiety, irritability, impulsive behavior, and difficulty responding calmly to everyday situations. Isolation doesn't affect only the mind. Physical health can change as well. Without normal social routines and environmental cues, some people begin struggling to keep track of time. Sleep schedules can become irregular, while headaches, dizziness, heightened sensitivity, and physical signs of stress may appear. Appetite can also change, and prolonged stress may interfere with digestion and normal eating patterns. These effects don't happen identically to everyone, but severe and extended isolation can place significant pressure on multiple systems throughout the body. People placed in extreme isolation may try to protect themselves by creating structure, maintaining a regular schedule, exercising appropriately. Reading, writing, and finding meaningful activities can provide some stability. These strategies can help, but they cannot completely replace human connection when someone is being isolated against their will. This is one reason prolonged solitary confinement has attracted criticism from the United Nations, human rights organizations, medical professionals, and other experts, with extreme forms of prolonged isolation being described as potentially cruel, inhumane, or torturous. Despite these concerns, solitary confinement has been used in correctional systems around the world. The practice, sometimes referred to as restrictive housing, separates prisoners from the broader prison population, often leaving them alone for most of the day. The United States has historically relied on this approach more heavily than many other countries. In 2019, Estimates suggested that more than 120,000 people in American prisons were experiencing some form of solitary confinement, with many spending approximately 22 to 24 hours each day inside small cells that often had limited natural light. The history of solitary confinement in America goes back more than 2 centuries. Quaker reformers introduced early versions of the system in the late 1700s, believing that separating prisoners from others would encourage reflection, repentance, and moral reform. This philosophy helped inspire the word penitentiary. The idea, however, soon attracted serious criticism. Observers argued that extreme isolation could damage rather than improve a person's mental state. The famous writer Charles Dickens was among those who strongly condemned the practice after witnessing its effects. Although its use declined at certain points, solitary confinement expanded again during the late 20th century. During the 1980s and the era of increasingly severe criminal justice policies, prison populations grew dramatically. Overcrowding, conflicts, protests, and violence created additional pressure on prison administrations. Solitary confinement became one of the tools authorities used to separate people considered difficult to manage or dangerous to others. But critics have pointed out that the practice has sometimes been applied to people accused of relatively minor violations, including conflicts with prison staff or breaches of institutional rules. The consequences can be especially serious for people who already have mental health difficulties. Instead of giving them an environment that supports recovery, prolonged isolation can intensify existing problems. Research has also suggested that the effects may continue even after a person leaves solitary confinement. Former prisoners can struggle with anxiety, concentration, social interaction, and feelings of safety in ordinary environments. Some report changes in their behavior and personality, while others experience heightened suspicion or difficulty reconnecting with family and society. There have been efforts to limit the practice. Some states have introduced restrictions involving people with serious mental health conditions, children, or pregnant individuals. Other policies have attempted to establish maximum periods for solitary confinement. However, enforcement can vary, and critics argue that exceptions and administrative loopholes sometimes allow people to remain isolated longer than intended. The debate continues because supporters often describe solitary confinement as a security measure, while opponents argue that severe isolation can undermine rehabilitation and may not reliably make prisons safer. Other countries have experimented with very different approaches. Norway, for example, generally uses a more rehabilitation-focused prison model with greater emphasis on education, employment, training, and preparing people for life after release. The country incarcerates a much smaller proportion of its population than the United States and invests substantially in rehabilitation and prison services. Norway has also reported relatively low rates of people returning to prison compared with many other nations. The broader lesson is difficult to ignore. Humans are social creatures, and meaningful connection, purpose, and interaction aren't simply comforts. They can be important parts of maintaining psychological stability and preparing people to function successfully in the world beyond isolation.